Today we are going to talk about Freud's concept of id, ego, and superego. Sigmund Freud is founder of psychoanalysis. He fundamentally redefined our understanding of the human experience at the turn of the 20th century. Known as the father of psychoanalysis, Freud moved beyond the biological medicine of his time to explore the unseen parts of the mind, suggesting that much of human behavior is driven by the unconscious. He introduced the revolutionary concept of talking cure, where patients could resolve psychological distress by bringing buried memories and repressed desire into conscious awareness. We need to talk about even Lionel Trilling, how he understood Freud's concept of id, ego, and superego. He wrote the essay Freud and Literature that we are going to deal with in more detail later on. But how he also looked at the concepts of id, ego, and superego. Lionel Trilling was a prominent American literary critic and scholar, known for his insightful analysis of literature and culture. Trilling was a leading figure in the New York intellectual circle. He taught at Columbia University for over 3 decades, influencing generations of students. Trilling's work often explored the relationship between literature and society, probing the complexities of human nature. His criticism is marked by erudition, nuance, and a deep engagement with European intellectual traditions. Trilling's notable works include The Liberal Imagination and The Opposing Self. He was a vocal critic of ideological simplifications and advocate for the complexity of literary experience. Trilling's essays are characterized by their elegance and intellectual rigor. So let us now understand these 3 prominent concepts one by one. So the id is what we say unconscious mind. The id is the primitive, chaotic, and unconscious part of our personality. It is present from birth and operates entirely on the pleasure principle. It demands immediate gratification of all needs, wants, and urges. It does not care about logic, reality, and social etiquettes. This is how Freud tried to explain id. He writes, id is the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. We approach the id with analogies. We call it a chaos. A cauldron full of seething excitations. The id serves as the raw energy source for the psyche. It serves as the raw energy source for the psyche, Without it, we would lack the drive to survive or reproduce. But if left unchecked, it would lead to impulsive and self destructive behavior. Schilling describes the id as the primitive, chaotic, and anarchic portion of the psyche. He views it as the source of man's creative energy. It is the source of man's creative energy and his most dangerous impulses. Schilling characterizes the id as the self indulgent and non logical core of human nature. It represents the instinctual drives that exist prior to cultural conditioning. He says the id is the hell within. Hell within. Schilling uses a powerful literary metaphor for the id, stating that man has a kind of hell within him from which rise everlastingly the impulses which threaten his civilization. For Schilling, it is also very positive. He said that id is the source of poetry because the id operates without syntactical conjunctions. It's not very systematic and thinks in images rather than logic. Schilling identifies it as the primary faculty of poetry making organ, that is, the human mind. Schilling concludes that id is Schilling concludes that id is the anarchic source of human complexities. It ensures that man is never a simple formula, but rather an inextricable tangle of culture and biology. It is the raw material of the human nature upon which the poet exercises their art. Coming to Freud's next concept, the ego. The ego is conscious mind. It is for rationality and reality. It stands for rational and real principle. The ego is the only part of personality that interacts with the outside world. Operating on the reality principle, its job is to satisfy the id's desire in ways that are socially acceptable and realistic. What Freud is saying about it? Freud writes, Sigmund Freud writes, the ego is not sharply separated from the id. The ego is not sharply separated from the id. Its lower portion merges into it. But the ego is that portion of the id which was modified by the proximity and influence of the external world. According to Freud, ego represents reason and common sense. It uses secondary processes thinking, that is rationality, to postpone gratification, ensuring that the individual functions effectively within the constraints of society. For Schilling, ego is utilitarian and rationalistic agency. He spends much of his essay defending Freud's commitment to the ego against those who see him as a champion of the irrational. Trilling asserts that, for Freud, positivistic rationalism is the very form and pattern of intellectual virtue. The ego is the faculty of intelligence and control. Trilling quotes Freud's foundational aim. I quote, "Where ego was, there ego shall be." This represents the effort to reclaim the dark territories of the id for the light of reason. For the light of reason. Trilling uses the ego to distinguish the artist from the neurotic. Artist from the neurotic. He writes, "The poet is in command of his own fantasy." The poet is in command of his own fantasy. There is difference between the poet and neurotic. The poet is in command of his own fantasy, that is, imagination, while it is exactly the mark of the neurotic. Neurotic, the person who loses rational faculty. So the neurotic is the person who is possessed by his fantasy. So the poet can control and uses imagination or imaginative faculty for creative work, while the neurotic are possessed by the fantasy. They cannot command. They cannot command and control fantasy. Rather, fantasy commands and controls the neurotic person. Trilling concludes that the ego is the hero of the Freudian system. It represents human capacity for active mastery over both internal impulses and external reality. It is the force that allows the artist to find a way back to reality after venturing into the depth of imagination. The poet is in command of his own fantasy, while it is exactly the mark of the neurotic that he is possessed by his fantasy. Let us discuss the third concept by Freud, and it is the superego. It stands for morality and conscience. It stands for morality and conscience. So Freud says that superego emerges around age 5 and it internalizes the moral standards and values learned from parents and society. He cultivates from the age of 5 certain moral standards and values from parents and society. It consists of two parts. One is conscience. One is conscience, which punishes with guilt, and the ego ideal, the mental image of who we should be. Its goal is not just to be realistic. Its goal is not just to be realistic, but to be perfect. Freud writes, the superego may be thought of as a specialized agency within the ego. It is also the vehicle of the ego ideal by which the ego measures itself, which it emulates, and whose demands for ever greater perfection it strives to fulfill. So, the The superego acts as a restrictive force while it provides a necessary moral framework. An overacting superego can lead to chronic guilt, anxiety, and an inability to enjoy life's basic pleasures. If we have to summarize and put it into few words, we can say that it is pleasure principle. It is instinctual, immediate gratification. It demands immediate gratification. Ego is reality principle. It is rational and strives for balance and safety. And superego is idealistic principle and strives for perfection and virtue. Freud famously compared the relationship between the ego and the id to a rider and a horse. The horse is id, provides the power and motion, while rider, that is ego, tries to direct that power towards a destination. The superego represents the moral restrictions and cultural values that have been internalized by the individual. In Trilling's view, it is the source of the guilt that fuels great tragedies. Trilling notes that ego must struggle to be more independent of the superego. If the superego is too strong, it leads to the paralysis seen in characters like Hamlet. The superego is psychological mechanism through which society enforces its demands. Trilling links this to the revolution in morals, where man is judged not just by his action, but by his internal struggle with authority. Trilling implies that without the superego, there would be no tragedy. The conflict between the id's desire and the superego's restrictions provides the tragic power that Freud and the great poets both explore. Tragic power that Freud and the great poets both explore. Trilling concludes that superego is the representative of civilization within the individual. While it can be source of neurosis, it is also what makes man a creature of far more dignity and far more interest. By providing the moral gravity necessary for human greatness. So, the interplay between id, ego, and superego creates a vision of man that is neither simply good nor easily understood. By showing the mind as a site of constant, dynamic struggle between these three forces, Freud provides a systematic account that matches the subtlety and complexity of the greatest literature. For Trilling, the ultimate value of these ideas is that they confirm the poet's ancient intuition that the human mind is inherently a site of conflict and creation. To conclude, Freud's structural model of id ego and superego offers a profound look at the internal friction that defines human nature. The id acts as the reservoir of primal instincts and the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification without regard for logic or social rules. In stark contrast, superego functions as the internal moral compass, striving for perfection and enforcing social standards through feelings of guilt. Navigating the constant battle between these two forces is the ego, which operates on the reality principle to find safe, socially acceptable ways to satisfy the id's desires. This tripartite system suggests that psychological health is not a static state but a dynamic balance maintained by ego's ability to mediate internal conflict. When the balance falters, the resulting tension manifests as anxiety, triggering the mind's defense mechanisms to protect the individual's sense of self. Freud's model fundamentally shifted the focus of psychology from external behavior to the complex, invisible architecture of the mind. Even a century later, this framework remains a pivotal tool for understanding how we weigh our deepest impulses against the demands of society. Ultimately, Freud's legacy lies in the idea that human self is not a unified whole, but a delicate, lifelong negotiation between our shadows and our ideals. That's it. Thank you.